What if the breakthrough in a 5-year missing children case came not from a detective, not from a witness, not from a single shred of evidence, but from a homeless dog nobody wanted? 3 young girls had disappeared without a trace. The trail was buried under years of dead ends and silence. Every lead had frozen over. Hope had all but stopped breathing. Then one bitter January afternoon, during a routine patrol through snow-blanketed wilderness, a police officer's German shepherd, a dog pulled from the streets, a dog with no history, no records, no past, planted his paws in the snow and refused to move another inch. No barking, no growling, just a full-body tremor and 2 amber eyes locked onto something deep inside a frosted ravine. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a training response. This was something older than all of that. Something no human in 5 years had ever been able to feel. What unfolded inside that ice-covered gorge, and why this dog reacted the way he did, would crack open the entire investigation and reveal a truth no one ever saw coming. If you believe dogs carry something inside them that we've long forgotten how to use, a love that outlasts time, a loyalty that doesn't care about logic, tap like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories that matter. The mountains surrounding Hollow Creek, Montana wore their winter like armor. Snow packed the high ridges white and silence pressed down over everything like a held breath. People in town still spoke about it in low voices. The afternoon 3 girls rode their bikes down the old timber road and never came back. 5 years had passed. Yet on certain evenings, residents of Birchwood Lane claimed they could still hear the sound of tires crunching through early frost. Their names were Clara Whitfield, 12, Sophie Aldrin, 11, and Nora Hayes, 11. They had left on a golden October afternoon, backpacks bouncing, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. They turned onto the gravel track that ran between the last fence post and the first wall of snow-dusted spruce trees. They did not come home. By sundown, porch lights blazed across Hollow Creek. By midnight, search helicopters carved through the dark. For 3 weeks, the mountains swallowed shouts, radio static, and the grief of hundreds of people refusing to accept the silence. Then the helicopters stopped. The search maps got folded away. The flyers went pale and curled at the edges in the frost. People learned, slowly, painfully, how to exist again. How to buy groceries. How to answer, "How are you?" without mentioning 3 names. But Hollow Creek never fully exhaled. Something fundamental had gone out of the town, like warmth leaving a room where a window has been left open too long. Sergeant Daniel Cole had been part of the search from the very first night. Back then he was 36, lean, driven, certain that enough effort could break any case wide open. Now he was 41, broader across the shoulders and quieter in a way that had nothing to do with peace. He lived alone at the edge of town where the plowed road gave way to packed snow and frozen ruts. He was a tall man, dark-haired with silver threading through at the temples, weathered jaw, dark eyes that had seen too many empty rooms. His heavy slate-gray patrol jacket had gone soft at the elbows from years of use. He wore it like a second skin. In the bottom drawer of his desk at the station sat a sealed cardboard box. Photographs, reports, a topographic map folded to pieces. No superior had asked him to keep it. He simply couldn't find a reason to let it go. Frost came into his life on the coldest morning of the following February. The dog was a white and silver German shepherd, roughly 7 years old, found staggering near the highway overpass with matted fur, ice crystals caught in his coat, and ribs you could count at a glance. The county shelter called the station. Someone had to decide. Daniel drove over intending to say no. Frost stood behind the wire, completely still, not barking, not pressing forward, not performing. He simply looked at Daniel with pale amber eyes that asked for nothing and offered everything. No desperation, just a steady, quiet regard. The department had discussed bringing in a working K-9 if an officer volunteered to handle the training. Daniel heard his own voice say yes before he'd finished the thought. Through the rest of winter and into a gray, slow spring, they worked together in frozen fields and quiet side streets. Frost learned quickly, moved without fuss, never strained against the leash unnecessarily. Daniel, worn out by noise and false leads, found that kind of steadiness more comforting than he ever expected. On a brittle January afternoon 5 years after the disappearance, the hills above Hollow Creek sat under a low white sky. Snow had fallen the night before, and the world felt sealed, muffled, and still. Daniel drove his patrol truck up a service road until the snowpack made it impassable, then continued on foot along a narrow game trail worn into the hillside. Routine work. Check for illegal camps. Look for trespassers. Remind the wilderness that someone still paid attention to these ridgelines. Frost moved ahead, his pale coat blending almost perfectly with the snow. Ears rotating, nose dragging low across the frozen ground. Their breath rose in soft clouds, twin rhythms against the cold silence. Then Frost stopped. No warning, no gradual slowing. He simply locked in place, every muscle in his body going rigid, as if he'd walked into an invisible wall. A sound rose from deep in his chest, not a growl exactly. Something between a whimper and a warning. His whole frame trembled. He took one step backward, then another, his eyes fixed on the dark opening of a narrow, snow-shadowed ravine ahead. The temperature seemed to drop. Daniel felt the cold bite through his jacket in a different way, somewhere behind his sternum. He gave the leash a short, gentle pull. "Come on, boy." His voice came out quieter than intended. Frost did not move. For the first time in nearly 2 years of working together, the dog flatly refused to take a single step forward. A thin wind slid through the ravine, carrying the smell of ice and spruce, and something older beneath it. Frost stood motionless on the trail, his pale coat trembling against the cold. Daniel watched him carefully. He had learned every signal this dog carried, the way his ears tilted, the way his breathing changed, the shift in his posture when he caught a scent worth following. But this was none of those things. This was something he hadn't seen before. Frost wasn't afraid. He was remembering. The shepherd stepped back again, eyes locked forward, the leash pulled straight between them. Daniel's pulse climbed without any logical reason. And without understanding why, his thoughts went to 3 names he had carried for 5 years. Clara, Sophie, Nora. He crouched and placed one hand on Frost's shoulder. The muscles beneath his palm shook with a deep, interior trembling, the kind that belongs to memory, not fear. Frost pulled, not away from the ravine, but toward a cluster of ancient, snow-bent junipers pressed against its wall. Daniel followed, boots punching through the icy crust, pushing snow-laden branches aside. He expected rock on the other side, another dead end in another canyon. Instead, there was a gap, barely wide enough to turn sideways through, a narrow passage of dark basalt hidden behind decades of overgrowth. Cold air breathed through it, older than the winter air outside. Daniel slipped through, Frost pressed against his leg, the dog's warm breath visible against the stone. The passage angled downward, walls scraping Daniel's jacket on both sides. Each step forward pressed on something deep inside him, a feeling he had buried long ago. What if the answer wasn't hidden? What if the world had simply been waiting for someone to push through the last wall? 12 yards in, the passage opened. A basin, no larger than a town square, ringed on all sides by sheer, snow-capped cliffs that completely cut the wind. The silence inside was absolute. No birdsong, no whisper of branches. Just the faint creak of a rope running through a wooden post. Daniel scanned the clearing with the careful, measured gaze of someone who had learned that safety is always temporary. A crude enclosure made of lashed spruce poles stood near the far wall, empty now. A fire pit, snow-dusted on top, but dark beneath, recently used. Flattened snow where something heavy had rested. Boot prints. Multiple sets. Life had been here. Recent life. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. The names rose again. He hated himself for it. This could be a poacher's camp. A survivalist. Another dead and dressed up in false promise. But the quiet was wrong. Too sealed. Too deliberate. Frost sat beside him, staring at the far side of the basin with complete stillness, ears straight and forward. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's back and steadied himself on that warmth. Whatever was here, truth or nothing, he would face it the same way he had faced every dark room over the last 5 years. Straight on. A gentle thought settled through him, quiet but solid as bedrock. If the world gives me one more chance, I will not turn away from it. Frost pressed his nose against Daniel's wrist. Not from fear, from certainty. Daniel nodded, not to the dog, but to himself. He would follow this through. The winter light lay flat and white over the hidden basin, casting no shadows. Daniel stood still, letting his eyes adjust. Then a sound broke the silence. A soft scrape. A slow shuffle of footsteps. A girl emerged from a low steel door set into the rock face. Thin as winter birch, skin pale with exhaustion and cold, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She wore an oversized wool sweater and pants that had been hemmed with rough stitching. She carried a metal bucket with both hands, the way someone carries something they've forgotten the purpose of. She looked about 15. Her eyes, wide, fractured, searching, found Daniel's face. The bucket hit the frozen ground with a hollow ring. Frost didn't lunge. He lowered his head and simply watched her with the patient stillness of an animal recognizing another creature that had been through too much. Daniel raised both hands slowly, palms open. His voice kept low and even. "It's all right. You're safe." She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply stopped moving, perfectly still. The stillness of someone who had learned over a very long time that stillness was safer than any other option. Her lips parted. No sound came out. Then she turned her head slightly, catching the pale winter light differently, and recognition hit Daniel like a stone dropping through ice. Nora Hayes, one of the three, 5 years older, 5 years lost. The steel door opened again behind her, and a man stepped out with the unhurried ease of someone who had never once doubted his own authority. Mid-40s, tall and broad through the chest, carrying himself with a rigid, controlled energy. Hair cut military short, going gray. A neat, close-trimmed beard. He wore a faded green field jacket with cargo pants the color of dirty snow, and a sidearm holstered at his hip like it had always lived there. His voice when he spoke was almost warm. "Sergeant Cole." The tone of a man greeting someone at a neighborhood barbecue. "This is posted private land. You'd be wise to head back." Marcus Hale, former lieutenant of the Hollow Creek Volunteer Search and Rescue. The man who had once stood at podiums delivering speeches about resilience and hope and never stopping the fight. The man this town had called a hero. Daniel felt the air change in his lungs. Not fear, something worse. The bone-deep wrongness of a thing that should be impossible. Hale stepped forward, thumb hooking near his holster. Casual, habitual, carrying all the threat it needed. "K9 units don't have jurisdiction up here," he said evenly. "Let's keep this clean." The message beneath the pleasantry was as sharp as frostbite. Daniel knew the math. One wrong move and Nora would be the one to pay for it. That knowledge settled into his bones like frozen ground. He backed away with careful, measured steps, every instinct screaming against the retreat, the girl's eyes following him with an expression too fragile and too agonizing to name. Hope, trying to exist in the body of someone who had almost stopped believing in it. Frost backed with him, step for step, trembling with restrained instinct. When the stone walls finally swallowed the basin behind them, Daniel climbed the slope in controlled silence, heart hammering, breath burning white in the frozen air. He had walked away to save her, not abandon her. And with each step upward through the snow, a quiet vow took shape inside him, solid and cold and unbreakable as the ice beneath his boots. He would come back for her. The ridge above the canyon was swept clean by a cutting northern wind. Daniel climbed until he reached a bare outcropping of rock where, on a clear day, a phone might catch a single bar of signal from the relay tower across the valley. Snow crystals stung his face. His fingers were numb before he got the phone out of his pocket. He waited. The signal flickered. He dialed. Sheriff Frank Dunn answered with the voice of a man who had carried a community's grief longer than grief was meant to be carried. Dunn was 57, thick-framed, steel-haired, slow to speak and impossible to rush. His patrol jacket was heavy canvas beige, worn at the cuffs. He didn't believe it at first, but the sound of Daniel's voice, the way he said Nora Hayes, that changed everything. The sheriff didn't ask again. He simply said, "Don't move. I'm coming." Within 40 minutes, the frozen ridgeline transformed. Sheriff's Department vehicles ground up through the snow from both Hollow Creek and the county seat. A Border Patrol convoy arrived with chains on the tires. A SWAT truck followed, its diesel engine thudding through the cold. A helicopter swept in low from the south, the sound of its rotors shaking powder from the spruce trees. The men and women who stepped out were armored and ready, faces tight, breath rising in white clouds. But their eyes carried something soft and barely contained. A hope they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in years. Sheriff Dunn stood at the center of it all, massive and composed, giving orders in a voice that made the cold itself seem temporary. When he reached Daniel, he placed one large hand on his shoulder. "If those girls are alive," he said quietly, each word landing like a footstep on frozen ground, "we bring them home before nightfall." Daniel couldn't speak. He nodded. Frost leaned against his leg, warm, steady, present. Dunn raised the bullhorn and let his voice roll across the canyon walls, calling Marcus Hale by name, demanding the release of the girls, offering a peaceful resolution. The world held its breath. Then a single gunshot cracked through the winter silence, and a chunk of snow-covered rock exploded 12 feet from Dunn's shoulder. Not meant to kill, meant to answer. The rescue had become a siege. Agents dove behind boulders and armored doors. The helicopter banked hard to the north. Frost barked once, one fierce, guttural sound, before Daniel pulled him close, whispering against his ear to hold steady. The canyon went still. Only the wind moved, threading through the rocks, carrying the hiss of radio static and the weight of decisions no one wanted to make. As the winter sun dropped behind the western peaks, floodlights blazed to life and threw the canyon into harsh white relief. Long shadows stretched across the snow. No one fired. No one advanced. Everyone held position in the frozen dark, suspended between danger and prayer. Dunn crouched beside Daniel, their shoulders nearly touching, breath steaming in the cold. "You saw her," he said, not a question. "A lifeline. She's alive." Daniel's voice came out rough. And she wasn't alone in there. The sheriff closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, his jaw was set. "Then we don't leave this mountain without them." Frost rested his head across Daniel's knee. The man pressed his palm into the dog's fur and felt something shift inside him. Not courage, not exactly. Something quieter and more durable. Purpose. The night gathered over the ridge, cold and absolute. And something long frozen inside Daniel Cole began, very slowly, to move. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with wood smoke and old wool and the particular staleness of a sealed place that had held the same fear for too long. Sophie Aldrin sat closest to the small iron stove, knees drawn to her chest, a rough wool blanket over her shoulders. At 15, she looked younger, eyes large and trusting, fixed on the man who paced the narrow room. She believed every word he said. She had believed him for years. Marcus Hale moved through the space with the calm, practiced authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice. He spoke of the world outside in the past tense, destroyed, diseased, forgotten. His tone was even and certain, as steady as a sermon. Grace clung to every word. Nora Hayes sat huddled near the bunk, arms around her knees, hair hanging in a loose curtain around her face. She had stopped crying years ago. She had stopped asking questions even longer ago than that. She had learned how to agree, how to appear convinced, even when something faint and stubborn inside her whispered that something didn't add up. Clara Whitfield sat apart near the far wall, long legs folded beneath her, pale blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She was 16 now, though the years in this place had taken something from her voice that age alone couldn't explain. She stared at the plank floor while Hale spoke, his familiar words falling over the room like snow, soft, relentless, obscuring everything underneath. But tonight the words didn't settle the way they usually did. Something was different. In her mind, an image kept surfacing. A man in a gray jacket, standing in open winter light. A pale dog pressed against his leg. Eyes that looked directly at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. And in those eyes, no cruelty. No possession. Just recognition. "I see you." She had buried memories like that for years. Survival had required it. But this one kept coming back, carrying with it the smell of cold spruce air and real wind and everything this bunker had never been able to replicate. Hale stopped pacing. He had noticed. He crossed to Clara and crouched before her, tilting her chin up with 2 fingers, his expression gentle and practiced. "You're struggling," he said softly. "That's the outside world trying to pull you back towards something that no longer exists. I brought you through that. I keep you safe." Sophie nodded earnestly. Nora closed her eyes. Clara almost agreed. The warmth of the room, the years of careful conditioning, the exhaustion of resistance, all of it pressed down on the small lit thing in her chest. But the image of the man and the pale dog didn't leave. The man's eyes stayed. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely used. He wasn't a ghost. The room went still. Sophie flinched. Nora's eyes opened. Hale's expression shifted, just barely, the warmth pulling back like frost forming. Clara, he said patiently, isolation creates visions. I've explained this. You saw what fear wanted you to see. Clara shook her head. One small, quiet, unbreakable motion. His eyes were real, she whispered. Real eyes don't look like that. The words hung between them in the cold air, trembling and fragile and entirely impossible to take back. For the first time, Nora lifted her face, not toward Hale, but toward Clara. And for the first time, Sophie looked less certain, something in her carefully constructed world beginning to crack. Hale stepped back, jaw tightening in the dim light. The bunker fell into a silence that had a different quality than any silence before it. Not the silence of control, the silence of something fundamental giving way. Clara pressed one hand flat against her chest and felt her own heartbeat, steady, stubborn, still entirely hers. For the first time in 5 years, she remembered she was someone worth coming home to. Soft blue darkness settled over the ridge. Frost refused to be still. While the tactical team held position behind vehicles and boulders, the shepherd pulled again and again toward the hidden stone passage, his claws raking the frozen ground. Small, urgent sounds working in his chest. Daniel knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders, studying his face in the white glow of the floodlights. He had seen many things in Frost's behavior over the past 2 years. He had learned to read them all. What he saw now was not anxiety. It was not aggression. It was longing, the raw, searching longing of someone straining towards something they have been separated from for far too long. Daniel leaned close. You know them, he whispered. Frost pressed his forehead against Daniel's chest with a trembling exhale that felt almost human. Daniel walked to Sheriff Dunn. The sheriff stood in the floodlight glow, hands on his belt, face weathered with hours of cold and tension. Daniel laid out what he believed, that Frost hadn't frozen in that ravine out of instinct to protect, but out of recognition. That the dog hadn't been reacting to danger. He had been reacting to the girls. Dunn stared at the shepherd for a long, wordless moment. Then at Daniel. The idea was the kind that could get men killed. It was also the only idea in 5 years that didn't feel like surrender. If he goes in alone, Daniel said carefully, Hale won't fire. The girls are his entire story. Hurting them in front of them destroys everything he spent years building. Frost can reach them in ways none of us can. The sheriff rubbed one hand across his jaw, eyes narrowed in calculation, the seconds stretching out cold and long. Then he nodded once. Not as a sheriff. As a man who refused to stop believing in the next thing that might actually work. Get him to the entrance, Dunn said quietly. We stand ready. The leash came off. Frost didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. He vanished into the dark mouth of the stone passage at full speed, his pale form swallowed by shadow and silence. Inside the bunker, the stillness lasted just long enough for dread to form, and then a burst of sharp, joyful barking shattered the stale air. Clara turned first. Frost hit her like a snowstorm, full body, tail flying, crying out in small, desperate sounds, pressing his face into her stomach, licking her hands, her wrists, her cheeks, as if he could undo every missing year through touch alone. Clara staggered, one hand buried in his fur, the other pressed over her mouth. Frost, she breathed, and the name came from somewhere deeper than memory, from the part of her that had never fully agreed to forget. Everything Hale had built shattered in a single moment. Frost pushed to Nora next, pressing his warm weight against her until she wrapped both arms around his neck and wept. Real tears, the first real tears in longer than she could measure. Then he turned to Sophie, who tried to pull back, still clinging to the world she'd been taught to believe in. He didn't force. He simply placed himself in front of her and whined, soft, patient, persistent, until her shaking hand found the top of his head and stayed there. The truth didn't arrive through argument. It didn't arrive through logic or evidence. It arrived the way it always does, when it arrives at all, through warmth. Through the impossibly familiar weight of a living creature who refused to pretend the years had changed what he knew. Then Clara found her voice. Not a whisper, a scream, torn from the deepest, most unsilenced part of her, echoing off the stone walls, rolling up through the passage and out into the frozen winter night. We're here. We're here. Help us. Nora's voice joined hers. Then Sophie's. 3 voices, rising together, for the first time not in fear, but in the absolute certainty that someone was listening. On the ridge, Daniel felt his knees buckle. Frost had not found them by tracking. He had come home to them, because some part of him had always known where home was. Outside, the winter night blazed with sirens and lights, and the organized chaos of a rescue finally real. Sophie was carried out on a stretcher, her body still shaking from years of trauma that would take far longer to thaw than one night could manage. Nora walked out between 2 medics, one hand lightly holding Frost's tail, needing movement, needing proof that the world still went forward. Clara stepped out under her own power. She didn't look like someone who had been rescued. She looked like someone who had survived something unsurvivable and chosen, on the other side of it, to remain gentle. The winter wind lifted her pale hair back from her face. She paused beside Daniel, not slowed by fear, slowed by intention. "Thank you," she whispered. Not for the rescue, for the belief, for someone seeing her before she could see herself. The canyon roared with noise and lights and the machinery of victory. But inside Daniel Cole, there was only quiet. He knelt beside Frost, pressed his forehead against the dog's muzzle, and breathed. "You brought them home," he murmured. Frost pressed back with a soft, tired sound and rested his chin on Daniel's shoulder. For the first time in 5 years, Daniel allowed himself to believe that healing wasn't just a story people told each other to get through the winter. After 5 years, 3 voices calling from inside that mountain hit the canyon like an avalanche. Every radio went quiet. Every boot stopped shifting in the snow. Even the helicopter seemed to pause. Then the echo broke across the cliffs, and Sheriff Frank Dunn lowered his bullhorn, closed his eyes for less than a second, and opened them harder than before. "Breach," he said quietly. Then louder. Then like thunder. "Breach. Breach. Breach." The team moved as one. Disciplined, precise, armor flashing in the floodlights, boots punching through the frozen crust. Daniel ran with them, Frost's leash in his fist, something surging through him too vast and raw to be named cleanly. The passage swallowed them single file, breath fogging, the cold walls pressing close. Frost pulled ahead, muscles coiled, tail low, guiding them forward through the dark like a pale flame. At the steel door, charges were set. Daniel was pulled back by a hand he didn't see. The explosion cracked through the stone. White flashbang light. The sound of a world being forced open. Then the team was through the haze, voices commanding, the sound of a body taken to the ground, a weapon skidding across ice-hard floor. Suspect restrained. Weapon secured. Those 4 words landed somewhere deep in Daniel's chest. For years of guilt breathed out. He stepped through the smoke behind the medics. Sophie sat against the wall with both hands over her ears, rocking, eyes shut. A paramedic, dark-haired, soft-voiced, late 30s, knelt beside her and spoke in the patient, low register of someone who understood that trauma doesn't require explanation. Sophie didn't respond at first, but she let the woman's hand rest on hers. Nora sat on the floor with her back against the bunk, both arms locked around Frost's neck, breathing hard but present, more awake than she had been in years, as if the world had just switched a light back on behind her eyes. And Clara was standing, thin, pale, hollow-cheeked, but standing, on her own feet, upright. She looked across the bunker at Daniel with red eyes and a face tracked with tears and grime. Then she looked down at Frost. She nodded once, a slow, certain, unadorned nod. "We made it." Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Spring came slowly to Hollow Creek that year, as if the valley didn't quite trust it yet. The trial was brief and without spectacle. Marcus Hale sat in the courtroom in his faded green field jacket, hands folded on the table, expression unreadable. He did not speak when the verdict was read. 2 consecutive life sentences. No parole, not vengeance, just the quiet arithmetic of consequence. Sheriff Dunn stood in the back of the courtroom, silver-haired, arms crossed, eyes closed for one long moment after the gavel fell, something enormous releasing from his shoulders. Daniel was there too, not as an officer, but as a witness who needed to see the last page with his own eyes to believe in endings. Sophie Aldrin spent months in the care of a trauma unit. Years of psychological conditioning do not dissolve with rescue, no matter how desperately everyone wants them to. Her body mended faster than her mind. Some days she could speak. Some days she could only sit beneath blankets and ask the nurses not to turn the lights too bright. But she had people, therapists who understood, a quiet social worker who visited on Tuesdays, a paramedic with patient eyes who read paperback novels aloud to her without asking for anything back. Nora Hayes recovered steadily, if carefully. She was guarded around strangers, slow to trust. But she trusted Frost within minutes and Daniel within days. In therapy, she said, quietly, that safety didn't feel like silence to her. It felt like breathing next to something alive that wasn't going anywhere. Clara was different from what anyone expected. She walked out of that bunker with something forged inside her that no amount of captivity had managed to extinguish. She cried. She struggled. She healed. But she healed like someone who had been waiting a long time for permission to fully exist again. She found that permission in Frost first, and then, slowly, in herself. The center wasn't a government initiative. It came from the town itself, a rancher who donated a parcel of land east of the creek, a retired carpenter who drove up with a truckload of timber, a dozen volunteers who showed up on a Saturday morning in late May with no instruction, and a shared need to build something good from the wreckage. 6 months after the rescue, a low, wide barn with soft pine walls and wide windows facing the mountain stood at the edge of Hollow Creek. The sign above the door read, Frost Ridge Animal Therapy Center. Inside, rescue dogs, 2 calm horses, and rooms designed for healing rather than interrogation. Daniel had traded his patrol jacket for a worn flannel shirt and quieter hands. He wasn't running from law enforcement. He had simply found that some forms of justice look more like patience than pursuit. Frost became the heart of the place. Children who wouldn't speak to adults would sit beside him in the straw and tell him things they couldn't say aloud. Veterans placed their hands on his back and relearned the rhythm of slow breathing. Clara came every week, sometimes to help with the younger children, sometimes just to sit beside the dog who had walked through stone walls to find her. On a still afternoon in late October, Daniel stood outside the barn as the first light snow of the season drifted down through the spruce trees. Frost lay beside him, eyes half closed, head resting across Daniel's boot. From inside the therapy ring came the sound of children laughing. Light, ordinary, unhurried laughter that Hollow Creek had once quietly given up on ever hearing again. Daniel looked down at the dog beside him and felt the warmth in his chest that had carried him through the darkest part of 5 winters. No medals, no parades, just this, the ordinary miracle of life continuing. He placed a hand on Frost's neck and said softly, "You saved more than those girls." The dog didn't move. He simply breathed, steady and content, as if saving people were the most natural thing in the world. And Daniel understood at last that the brightest light doesn't always come from the moment of victory. Sometimes it comes from the long, cold walk through the dark, side by side, refusing to let go of each other. This story isn't really about a dog. It isn't really about a rescue. It's about the truth that none of us are ever completely lost as long as love still knows the way back to us. If this story stayed with you, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe. I'm a new storyteller working toward my first 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you genuinely matters. God bless you, and may warmth find you in every cold season ahead.